I knew something was wrong the moment I saw Brenda Patterson standing at the edge of my property line with her arms crossed, and that pursed lip expression she reserved for people she considered beneath her. I had just finished demolishing an old barn on my 10-acre spread outside of Prescott, Arizona, and my excavator was still rumbling beside me when she marched over like she owned the place. "Isaac Harrison, we need to talk about community cooperation," she said, her voice dripping with the kind of fake sweetness that made my teeth ache. I killed the engine and climbed down from the cab, wiping sweat from my forehead with the back of my hand. It was pushing 95 degrees, even though it was only 10 in the morning, and I had been working since dawn. The last thing I needed was a lecture from the HOA president about whatever imaginary violation she had cooked up this time. "What can I do for you, Brenda?" I asked, keeping my tone neutral. After 3 years of living in this community, I had learned that engaging with her hostility only made things worse. She gestured dramatically at the excavator, a massive Caterpillar 320 that I had purchased 6 months ago specifically for the renovation work I was doing on my property. "The HOA is planning to install a new drainage system along the eastern property line, and we need to borrow your equipment for the project." I stared at her for a long moment, certain I had misheard. "You want to borrow my excavator?" "Not borrow, exactly," she said, her smile widening in a way that made my stomach turn. "As a member of this community, you have certain obligations to contribute to neighborhood improvements." We calculated that renting equipment would cost the HOA approximately $8,000, and since you already own suitable machinery, it only makes sense that you provide it for community use. The audacity of the statement left me momentarily speechless. This excavator had cost me nearly $200,000, and she wanted me to just hand it over like it was a lawn mower. "Brenda, that's not how this works. This is professional construction equipment, not a community resource." Her expression hardened instantly, the fake sweetness evaporating like water on hot asphalt. "I see. So you're saying you're unwilling to be a team player. That's very disappointing, Isaac. The board will need to discuss this attitude at our next meeting." "Discuss whatever you want," I said, turning back toward the excavator. "But my equipment isn't available for HOA projects, free or otherwise." She made a huffing sound that reminded me of an angry cat and stalked away across the scrubland that separated our properties. I watched her go, already knowing this wouldn't be the end of it. Brenda Patterson had been president of the Copper Ridge Homeowners Association for 7 years, and in that time, she had made it her personal mission to micromanage every single resident within the development's boundaries. What made my situation particularly frustrating was that my property predated the HOA by nearly 40 years. My grandfather had purchased this land back in 1985, and I had inherited it when he passed away in 2021. The Copper Ridge development had been built in stages starting in 2018, gradually surrounding my grandfather's old homestead on 3 sides. When the development reached critical mass, they formed an HOA and immediately began pressuring me to join. I had resisted for 2 years before finally giving in, mainly because they controlled access to the only decent road leading to town, and they had threatened to gate it off if I didn't become a member. My lawyer had advised me to join under protest and document everything, which I had been doing meticulously ever since. The rest of that day passed without incident, and I spent the afternoon clearing debris from the barn demolition. My plan was to build a new workshop on the site, something modern with proper electrical service and climate control. I made my living as an independent contractor, specializing in custom metalwork and fabrication, and the old barn had been inadequate for my needs from day one. 3 days later, I received a certified letter from the HOA. Inside was a formal notice stating that I was in violation of Section 7.3 of the Community Bylaws, which dealt with obstruction of community improvement projects. The letter demanded that I make my excavator available for HOA use within 14 days or face daily fines of $500. I read the letter 3 times, each time getting angrier. Section 7.3 dealt with homeowners who blocked access to common areas during approved construction projects. It had nothing to do with forcing residents to provide their personal equipment for HOA use. This was Brenda manufacturing a violation out of thin air because I had refused her ridiculous demand. I called my lawyer, Martin Reeves, and read him the letter over the phone. He was quiet for a long moment before responding. "This is absurd, Isaac. They have no legal authority to commandeer your personal property. Don't respond to this letter yet. Let me draft something that makes their position very clear from a legal standpoint. How much is this going to cost me?" I asked, already doing the mental math on my savings account. "Don't worry about that right now. This is such obvious overreach that I think one strongly worded letter will shut it down. If it doesn't, we can discuss next steps." I felt marginally better after hanging up, but I couldn't shake the feeling that Brenda wasn't going to back down easily. She had a reputation for being vindictive, and I had just publicly refused one of her demands. That wasn't something she would forget. The following week, Martin sent his letter to the HOA board, carefully explaining why their demand was legally baseless and warning them that any attempt to fine me would result in immediate litigation. I thought that would be the end of it, but I was wrong. 2 weeks later, I was driving back from a job site in Phoenix when I noticed unusual activity at the far corner of my property. There were several vehicles parked along what I had always assumed was my eastern boundary line, and I could see people moving around with surveying equipment. I pulled over immediately and walked across the desert scrub to investigate. Brenda was there, along with 2 men I didn't recognize and another HOA board member named Gary Foster. They had set up stakes connected by bright orange string, creating a boundary line that cut approximately 2 acres off my property. "What's going on here?" I demanded, my heart already pounding with anger. Brenda turned to face me with an expression of exaggerated surprise. "Oh, Isaac, hello. We're just conducting a property survey for the new community clubhouse. The board voted to approve the construction last month." "On my property," I said, my voice rising despite my efforts to stay calm. "It's not your property," Gary interjected, holding up a rolled set of plans. "According to county records, this parcel is designated as common area. Your property line is about 200 feet west of here." I knew for a fact that was wrong. My grandfather had had the property surveyed multiple times over the years, most recently in 2019, when I was dealing with the initial HOA pressure. I had copies of all those surveys, and they clearly showed my property extending all the way to the eastern ridge. "That's incorrect," I said, forcing my voice to remain level. "I have current surveys that show this is private property. Whatever records you're looking at are wrong." Brenda shrugged dismissively. "We had a professional survey done by Morrison and Associates out of Prescott. They're very reputable. Perhaps your documents are outdated." "My last survey was done in 2019, I said. "And this land has been in my family since 1985. You can't just claim it because you want to build something here." "We're not claiming anything," Gary said. "We're simply developing common area land according to proper procedures. If you have concerns about the property line, you're welcome to file a dispute with the county." I realized they had no intention of listening to reason. They had decided they wanted this land, and they were going to take it through whatever bureaucratic manipulation they could manage. "Stop what you're doing right now," I said. "Do not begin any construction on this property. I'm contacting my lawyer today." "You're welcome to do that," Brenda said, her smile cold. "But interfering with approved HOA construction projects is a violation of Section 8.2, which carries fines of $1,000 per day. I'd hate to see you rack up unnecessary penalties." I walked away before I said something I would regret, pulling out my phone as soon as I was back at my truck. Martin answered on the third ring, and I explained the situation while trying to keep my voice from shaking with rage. "They can't do that," Martin said immediately. "Do you have copies of your surveys accessible?" "Everything's in my filing cabinet at home. I can scan and email them to you within the hour." "Do that. I'll start drafting an emergency injunction to stop any construction pending a proper boundary determination." "This is going to cost more than the letter, Isaac. We're probably looking at several $1,000s in legal fees." "I don't care," I said. "They're not stealing my land." That evening, I spent 3 hours scanning documents and forwarding them to Martin. In addition to the surveys, I sent him copies of my grandfather's original deed, property tax records going back to the 1980s, and every piece of correspondence I had ever received regarding property boundaries. It was a substantial file, and I felt confident that we had the documentation to prove ownership. Martin moved quickly, and within 2 days we had a hearing scheduled with a judge in Prescott. The hearing was set for the following week, which meant the HOA was temporarily barred from beginning construction until the matter could be resolved. I thought the injunction would buy us time to sort everything out properly, but Brenda apparently viewed it as a declaration of war. 2 days after the injunction was served, I received another certified letter informing me that I was being fined for 17 separate violations, ranging from unauthorized fence color, to excessive vegetation, to unapproved vehicle storage. The total fines amounted to nearly $12,000. Every single violation was fabricated or based on such twisted interpretations of the bylaws that they were laughable. My fence was the same color it had been since 2019. The excessive vegetation was natural desert scrub that had always been there, and the unapproved vehicle storage referred to my excavator, which was parked on my own property in an area not visible from any community street. Martin was livid when I forwarded him the letter. "This is harassment, plain and simple. We're going to add this to our case and ask for sanctions against the HOA board. They're clearly retaliating against you for asserting your property rights." The hearing arrived quickly, and I found myself sitting in a Yavapai County courtroom on a Wednesday morning, watching Martin lay out our case to a judge who looked increasingly skeptical of the HOA's position. Brenda had hired her own attorney, a slick-looking guy named Philip Marchand, who presented their survey and argued that all prior property records were unreliable. Martin countered by presenting our complete chain of title documentation, multiple professional surveys, and property tax records that consistently showed the disputed area as part of my parcel. He also submitted the retaliatory fine letters as evidence of the HOA's bad faith. The judge took less than 10 minutes to make his decision. Based on the evidence presented, I find that Mr. Harrison has clearly established ownership of the disputed parcel. The HOA is permanently enjoined from claiming or developing this property. Additionally, I'm ordering the HOA to rescind all fines issued to Mr. Harrison within the past 30 days and to pay his attorney's fees in the amount of $8,500. This court does not look favorably on attempts to use HOA authority for purposes of harassment and intimidation. I felt a surge of relief and vindication as the judge's gavel came down. Brenda's face had gone red, and she whispered furiously to her attorney as we filed out of the courtroom. I thought this would finally be the end of our conflict, but once again, I underestimated her capacity for spite. For about 2 weeks, things were quiet. The HOA paid Martin's fees without comment, and I received formal notice that the fines had been rescinded. I went back to work on my property, making steady progress on the new workshop foundation. Then one morning in late August, I woke up to the sound of heavy machinery. I threw on clothes and rushed outside to find a shocking scene. The HOA had begun construction anyway, about 50 feet inside what the judge had explicitly ruled was my property line. There were 2 concrete trucks, a small crane, and a crew of at least a dozen workers actively pouring a foundation for what looked like a substantial building. I grabbed my phone and immediately called the police, then called Martin. The police arrived first, 2 deputies from the Yavapai County Sheriff's Office who looked confused by the situation. I explained about the court order and showed them copies of the injunction on my phone. "This is a civil matter," one deputy said. "We can't force them to stop working based on a property dispute." "It's not a dispute anymore," I argued. "A judge ruled definitively that this is my property. They're trespassing and constructing an unauthorized building on private land." The deputy looked uncomfortable, but agreed to talk to the construction foreman. I watched as he had a brief conversation with a burly guy in a hard hat, who made a phone call and then shook his head. The deputy came back to me. "He says they have authorization from the HOA and permits from the county. Unless you can show me documentation that proves they're violating a specific law right now, we can't shut them down. You need to take this up with your lawyer and the courts." I wanted to scream in frustration, but I understood the deputy's position. By the time Martin arrived 20 minutes later, the concrete trucks had finished pouring, and the crew was beginning to set up forms for walls. Martin took one look at the scene and pulled out his phone. He spent the next hour making calls, and by noon, we had another emergency hearing scheduled for the following morning. But that meant the construction would continue unchecked for the rest of the day, and I had to watch helplessly as they made rapid progress on what appeared to be a fairly large building. That evening, I walked down to examine the construction site after the crew had left. The foundation was massive, at least 3,000 square feet, and the plans posted on a nearby board showed a 2-story structure labeled Copper Ridge Community Clubhouse. They were building a full recreational facility on my property without permission, apparently betting that they could either tie up the legal process long enough to complete it, or somehow force me to accept it after the fact. The next morning's hearing was tense. The judge was the same one who had ruled in my favor 2 weeks earlier, and he did not look happy to see the same parties back in his courtroom so soon. Martin presented photos I had taken of the construction site, along with GPS coordinates confirming it was on my property, well within the boundaries established by the previous ruling. "Your Honor, the HOA has willfully violated this court's injunction and is currently engaged in unauthorized construction on my client's private property. We're asking for immediate sanctions and an order compelling them to remove everything they've built." Philip Marchand, the HOA's attorney, stood up with what I can only describe as impressive audacity. "Your Honor, there's been an unfortunate miscommunication. The HOA believed the construction site was positioned on the community side of the boundary line. As soon as we became aware of the error, we halted construction." "That's a lie," I said. immediately earning a sharp look from the judge. "Mr. Harrison, you'll have your opportunity to speak when I ask for your input," the judge said. He turned back to Marchand. "When exactly did you halt construction?" "Yesterday evening, Your Honor." "And when did you become aware of the alleged error?" Marchand hesitated for just a fraction of a second. "Yesterday afternoon." "So you're telling me that despite having a court order clearly establishing the property line, and despite having your own survey documents that should have shown exactly where that line fell, you somehow accidentally began construction approximately 50 feet onto Mr. Harrison's property?" "It was an error in translating the survey data to the physical site, Your Honor." The judge leaned back in his chair, his expression making clear he didn't believe a word of it. "Here's what's going to happen. The HOA will immediately remove all construction materials, equipment, and concrete from Mr. Harrison's property. You have 72 hours to restore the land to its original condition. If this is not completed within that time frame, Mr. Harrison is authorized to hire contractors to do the work at HOA expense. Additionally, the HOA will pay Mr. Harrison's attorney's fees for this hearing, which I'm setting at $12,000, and will pay Mr. Harrison directly the sum of $20,000 in damages for trespass and contempt of court. Do I make myself clear?" Brenda shot to her feet. "Your Honor, that's outrageous. The HOA doesn't have that kind of money readily available." "Then you should have thought about that before you violated my order, Miss Patterson. I suggest you hold a special assessment or whatever other fundraising is necessary. You have 30 days to pay the monetary judgments." Dismissed. I felt a wave of satisfaction as we left the courthouse, but it was tempered by the knowledge that Brenda would never forgive this public humiliation. Martin seemed to sense my concern. "Watch her carefully," he advised. "People like that don't take losing well. Document everything that happens on your property and call me immediately if she tries anything else." I took his advice seriously. When I got home, I ordered and installed a complete security camera system covering my property boundaries, with special attention to the area where the HOA had tried to build. The cameras were high definition and backed up automatically to cloud storage, so I would have a complete record of any future incidents. The HOA did remove the construction materials within the 72-hour deadline, but they did a sloppy job of it. They jackhammered out the concrete and hauled it away, but they left the ground torn up and damaged. I had to spend 2 days with my excavator grading and repairing the area, which I added to my documentation of damages. The monetary judgments took longer. The HOA missed the 30-day deadline, and Martin had to file for enforcement. Eventually, I received a check for $32,000, which covered both the damage award and attorney's fees. It felt like a win, but I knew it had come at the cost of making a permanent enemy of the HOA president. For several months, things were relatively quiet. I finished my workshop and moved my fabrication equipment into it, and I started taking on larger projects that the improved facility made possible. I kept waiting for Brenda's next move, but as fall turned to winter, it seemed like maybe she had finally accepted defeat. I should have known better. In late February, I had to travel to Albuquerque for a week to complete a large commissioned piece for a client there. I made arrangements for a neighbor to check on my property, but he was only stopping by every couple of days. When I returned home on a Sunday afternoon, I immediately noticed something different about the sight line at the eastern edge of my property. I drove my truck down to investigate and found myself staring in disbelief at a completed building. It wasn't just any building, it was the clubhouse they had tried to build before, but finished. It was a beautiful 2-story structure with cedar siding, large windows, and professional landscaping. There was even a paved parking area and walkway leading to the front entrance. The building was positioned about 30 feet inside my property line, on a piece of land that the court had explicitly and repeatedly confirmed belonged to me. They hadn't just attempted construction. This time they had actually completed an entire building while I was gone. I felt like I had been punched in the stomach. The sheer audacity of it was staggering. They knew they were violating court orders. They knew they were building on my land without permission. They had just decided to do it anyway, probably calculating that once the building was complete, I would be less likely to demand its removal. I took extensive photos and videos, then immediately called Martin even though it was Sunday evening. He didn't answer, so I left a detailed message and sent him the photos. Then I called the sheriff's office again, with predictably useless results. Monday morning, Martin called me back sounding angrier than I had ever heard him. "This is criminal trespass at minimum, possibly fraud and contempt of court. We're going to file charges this time, not just a civil complaint. Take me through the timeline again." I explained that I had left on February 18th and returned on February 25th. The building had definitely not been there when I left, which meant they had completed the entire structure in 1 week. "That's impossibly fast for legitimate construction," Martin said. "They must have been prefabricating components and staged everything for rapid assembly." "This was premeditated, Isaac. They planned this specifically for when you would be away." "How did they even know I was traveling?" I asked. "Good question. Do you mention travel plans on social media?" "No, I barely use social media." "Then someone in the community must have been watching your patterns. Either way, we need to move fast. I'm going to file for another emergency hearing and simultaneously contact the county prosecutor's office about criminal charges. In the meantime, do not go near that building. Don't touch it. Don't enter it. Don't do anything that they could claim as vandalism or interference." The emergency hearing was scheduled for Wednesday, and I spent Tuesday documenting everything I could about the illegal structure. I checked county permitting records and found nothing they had built it without any permits at all, which was a separate violation. I also discovered through my security camera footage that construction had begun literally the same day I left for Albuquerque, which supported Martin's theory that this had been carefully planned. Wednesday's hearing was the most intense yet. This time, the judge ordered Brenda, Gary, and the third board member, a woman named Susan Winters, to appear personally. The HOA's attorney, Philip Marchand, looked distinctly uncomfortable as the proceedings began. Martin laid out our case methodically. The previous court orders, the property line determinations, the photographic evidence of the new building, and the timeline showing it had been constructed while I was traveling. He also presented the lack of building permits and the security footage showing construction beginning hours after I left town. The judge listened to everything and then turned to the HOA board members. "Does anyone want to explain to me how this happened?" There was a long silence. Finally, Brenda stood up. "Your Honor, the community desperately needs a clubhouse. We've been planning this project for 3 years, and we invested substantial funds in the design and materials. Mr. Harrison has been unreasonably blocking legitimate community development through frivolous legal complaints. Miss Patterson, are you aware that you're currently in a courtroom under oath and that you've just admitted to knowingly violating multiple court orders?" Brenda's confident expression faltered. "I'm saying that sometimes you have to take action for the greater good of the community." "The greater good does not include breaking the law," the judge said, his voice hard. "Let me be very clear about something. Property rights are fundamental in this country. No HOA, no board, No community need supersedes an individual's right to control their private property. You have repeatedly and willfully violated this principle, and you've done so in defiance of explicit court orders. He shuffled through some papers on his desk before continuing. Here's my ruling. First, the structure is to be completely demolished and removed within 14 days. Not dismantled, not relocated, demolished. Mr. Harrison will select the demolition contractor, and the HOA will pay all costs. Second, the HOA will pay Mr. Harrison the sum of $150,000 in punitive damages, in addition to all attorney's fees and costs. Third, I am referring this matter to the Yavapai County Prosecutor for criminal investigation, because what you've done here crosses the line from civil dispute into criminal activity. Brenda's face went pale. Your Honor, the HOA doesn't have that kind of money. A payment of that size would require us to levy special assessments that would cost each homeowner thousands of dollars. Then, you should have considered that before you built an illegal structure on someone else's property. Perhaps when your neighbors receive those assessment bills, they'll think more carefully about who they elect to the HOA board. The gavel came down, and I felt a complex mixture of vindication and shock. I had won, clearly and decisively, but the scale of the HOA's violation was so extreme that I was still processing what had happened. As we left the courthouse, Martin put a hand on my shoulder. Congratulations, but brace yourself. That criminal referral is serious, and when the prosecutor starts investigating, things are going to get messy for those board members. He was right. Over the next 2 weeks, while I was selecting a demolition contractor and overseeing the scheduling, the local news got hold of the story. Apparently, a court case involving an HOA building an entire clubhouse on someone's private property was interesting enough to warrant coverage, and suddenly, I was fielding calls from reporters. I declined most interviews, but I did agree to speak with one journalist from the Prescott Daily Courier who seemed genuinely interested in the property rights issues rather than just the sensational aspects. The article that resulted was fair and accurate, and it prompted even more attention. The demolition was scheduled for March 15th, and I decided to be present for it. I arrived early in the morning to find that I wasn't the only one interested in watching. At least 30 people from the community had gathered at a safe distance, and I recognized many of them as residents who had always kept their distance from me because of my conflicts with the HOA. Several people approached me before the demolition began. A man about my age named Tom Chen was the first. I just want to say I'm sorry we didn't stand up for you sooner. A lot of us have been intimidated by Brenda for years, and we knew what she was doing to you was wrong, but nobody wanted to be her next target. Others echoed similar sentiments. A retired couple, the Mitchells, told me they had been fined thousands of dollars over the years for minor violations, and had just paid them to avoid the hassle of fighting. A single mother named Jennifer Cruz said Brenda had threatened to fine her for her children's toys being visible in the yard, which violated some aesthetic provision of the bylaws. It became clear that I wasn't Brenda's only victim. I was just the first one who had the resources and stubbornness to fight back effectively. The conversation was still going when the demolition equipment arrived, and we all stepped back to watch. The demolition crew was professional and efficient. They had the proper permits, safety barriers, and equipment, and they worked quickly to bring down the illegal clubhouse. It took most of the day, but by evening the structure had been reduced to rubble and loaded into dump trucks for removal. I felt a profound sense of relief watching it disappear. For months, that building had represented Brenda's contempt for property rights and the rule of law. Its removal felt like justice finally being served. the criminal investigation moved forward quickly. The prosecutor assigned to the case was a sharp woman named Diana Foster who took the matter seriously. She interviewed me twice, reviewed all the court records, and subpoenaed documents from the HOA and the construction company that had built the clubhouse. What she discovered was damning. The construction company, it turned out, had expressed concerns about building without permits and on disputed property. Brenda had provided them with falsified documents claiming the property was HOA common area and that all necessary permits had been obtained. She had essentially committed fraud to induce the construction company to do illegal work. Additionally, the investigation revealed that Brenda had been embezzling HOA funds for years to support her lavish lifestyle. The clubhouse project had been partly an attempt to cover up the missing money by creating a legitimate expense that would explain the depleted reserves. In late April, Brenda Patterson was arrested and charged with fraud, embezzlement, criminal trespass, and conspiracy. Gary Foster and Susan Winters were charged as accomplices, though their charges were less severe. The local news coverage was intense, and the story even got picked up by some national outlets as an example of HOA overreach gone criminal. The community held an emergency meeting to recall the entire board and elect new leadership. I was invited to attend, and for the first time, I felt like I was actually part of the community rather than an outsider under siege. The new board president, a reasonable guy named Frank Morrison, approached me afterward. "I want to apologize on behalf of the community for everything you've been through. The new board is committed to operating within the law and treating all homeowners fairly. We're also going to be reviewing the bylaws to eliminate some of the more ridiculous provisions that Brenda used as weapons against people." I appreciated the sentiment, and over the following months, I did see positive changes. The new board was transparent, held regular meetings, and seemed genuinely interested in serving the community rather than controlling it. The civil judgments against the HOA were more complicated. The $150,000 in punitive damages was significant, and the HOA's insurance refused to cover it because it resulted from intentional illegal activity. The board was forced to levy a special assessment of approximately $3,000 per household to cover the payment. I actually felt bad about that, because most of the homeowners had been victims of Brenda's regime rather than supporters of it. I reached out to Frank Morrison with a proposal. I would accept a reduced payment of $75,000 if the HOA agreed to substantial reforms to the bylaws and governance procedures. Specifically, I wanted provisions that would make it much harder for any future board to abuse their authority. Frank brought the proposal to the community, and it passed overwhelmingly. I received my payment, the bylaws were reformed, and the HOA even issued a formal apology for the violations of my property rights. The criminal case against Brenda took longer to resolve. Her attorney tried various defenses, but the evidence was overwhelming. In September, she accepted a plea deal. She pled guilty to embezzlement and fraud charges in exchange for the trespass and conspiracy charges being dropped. She was sentenced to 3 years in prison, with the possibility of parole after 18 months, and was ordered to pay full restitution of the embezzled funds, which totaled almost $200,000. Gary Foster and Susan Winters both pled guilty to lesser charges and received probation and community service. They were also permanently barred from serving on any HOA board in Arizona. Throughout all of this, I had been thinking about what to do with the land where the illegal clubhouse had been built. It was now just bare ground, scraped clean by the demolition crew. The location was actually quite nice, with good views of the surrounding desert hills. I decided to turn it into something positive. I donated a 1-acre parcel to the community with specific deed restrictions. It could only be used for a small neighborhood park with a playground and picnic area, and it could never be built upon or developed beyond those simple amenities. The donation wasn't required, and it cost me land that I could have used for other purposes, but it felt like the right way to turn a negative situation into something that would benefit everyone. The community was thrilled with the donation, and volunteers turned out to help develop the park. We built a playground using equipment purchased through a fundraising drive, installed picnic tables and benches, and planted native desert plants for shade and aesthetics. The work brought people together in a way I hadn't seen before, and by the time we had a grand opening in November, I felt like I had more friends in the community than I had made in the previous 4 years combined. At the opening ceremony, Frank Morrison gave a short speech. "This park represents something important. It shows that we can come together as a community based on cooperation and mutual respect, rather than coercion and fear." Isaac Harrison had every right to keep this land for himself, but he chose to share it with all of us. That's the kind of neighbor we should all aspire to be. People clapped, and several came up to shake my hand and thank me personally. It was a far cry from the hostile environment I had endured under Brenda's leadership. My own project, the workshop renovation, was finally complete. I had a state-of-the-art facility for my metalworking business, and the improved capabilities allowed me to take on more ambitious projects. I landed several high-profile commissions, including a decorative gate installation for a resort in Sedona and a sculpture for a corporate plaza in Phoenix. The excavator that had been at the center of the initial conflict with Brenda was still parked beside my workshop, a reminder of where everything had started. I used it regularly for various projects, and I always felt a small sense of satisfaction knowing that she had never gotten her hands on it. By the time winter arrived again, life had settled into a comfortable routine. The HOA operated smoothly under the new board, enforcing reasonable rules in reasonable ways. My business was thriving, and I had built genuine friendships within the community. I ran into Tom Chen at the hardware store one day in early December, and we ended up having coffee to discuss a potential collaboration. He was an architect, and he had an idea for a project that would combine his design skills with my fabrication abilities. As we talked, he brought up the events of the previous year. "You know, what you went through with Brenda was awful, but in a weird way it might have been the best thing that could have happened to this community. Her arrest and the exposure of the embezzlement made everyone wake up to how corrupt the HOA had become. If you hadn't fought back, she might have continued unchecked for years." I considered that perspective. It was true that the community was in much better shape now than it had been under Brenda's authoritarian rule. The reformed bylaws protected homeowners from arbitrary enforcement. The new board was transparent and accountable, and people generally seemed happier and more engaged with community affairs. I guess sometimes you have to fight back against bullies, even when it's expensive and stressful, I said. Property rights matter, and the rule of law matters. If people in positions of power can just ignore court orders and do whatever they want, then we don't really have a functioning system. Tom nodded. A lot of people have said that watching you stand up to Brenda inspired them to be more assertive in their own lives. You showed that one person with determination and good legal representation can make a difference. I appreciated the sentiment, though I had never set out to be any kind of inspiration. I had simply wanted to protect my property and my rights, and I had been fortunate enough to have the resources to do so effectively. As the holidays approached, the community organized its first winter festival in the new park. There were food trucks, craft vendors, a bonfire, and entertainment. I brought my dog, a rescue German shepherd named Duke, and spent the evening wandering around talking with neighbors. Jennifer Cruz, the single mother I had met during the demolition, introduced me to her kids. The youngest, a boy about 6 years old, looked up at me with wide eyes. "Are you the man who made the park?" "I helped," I said, "but a lot of people worked on it together." "It's my favorite place," he said seriously. "Thank you." That simple, genuine gratitude from a child meant more to me than any of the legal victories or financial settlements. This was what community was supposed to be about, creating spaces and opportunities that improved everyone's quality of life. As the evening wound down and people began heading home, Frank Morrison found me near the bonfire. "I wanted to let you know that we've finalized the historical marker for the park. It's going to acknowledge your donation and also serve as a reminder about the importance of respecting property rights and the rule of law. We're planning to install it in the spring." "That's not necessary," I said. "I didn't donate the land to get recognition." "I know you didn't, but it's important for future residents to understand the history and the values we're trying to uphold. This community came very close to being destroyed by one person's corruption and abuse of power. We don't want people to forget that." I understood his point and agreed that the marker could serve an educational purpose. We shook hands, and I headed home with Duke trotting beside me. That night, sitting in my completed workshop with the heater running and the sound of wind outside, I reflected on everything that had happened over the past 18 months. It had been an exhausting, expensive, and often frustrating fight. There had been times when I wondered if it was worth the stress and cost, times when I considered just giving up and maybe even selling the property to escape the conflict. But I had stuck with it, and in the end, justice had prevailed. Brenda was in prison. The embezzled funds were being recovered, the community had reformed its governance, and I had my property rights fully protected by multiple court orders. More than that, I had helped catalyze positive change that would benefit the community for years to come. The excavator was visible through the workshop window, illuminated by the security lights I had installed. I smiled, thinking about Brenda's initial demand that I let the HOA use it for free. If she had approached me reasonably, explaining the drainage project and offering fair compensation for equipment rental, I probably would have agreed. But she had demanded it as if it were her right to commandeer my property, and that arrogance had ultimately been her downfall. The legal system had worked exactly as it was supposed to. When one party violated another's rights, courts enforced the law and imposed consequences. When those violations crossed the line into criminal conduct, prosecutors held the offenders accountable. It had taken time and money and effort, but the system had delivered justice. As winter settled over Prescott and the year drew to a close, I felt a sense of peace that I hadn't experienced in a long time. My business was successful. My workshop was everything I had hoped it would be, and I was part of a community that valued cooperation over coercion. The following spring brought new growth, both literal and metaphorical. The native plants in the park began to bloom, bringing splashes of color to the desert landscape. The historical marker was installed with a small ceremony attended by most of the community. It read, "This park was made possible by the generosity of Isaac Harrison, who donated this land to the community in 2025. It stands as a reminder that property rights are fundamental, that the rule of law protects us all, and that true community is built on mutual respect rather than coercion." I brought my father to the ceremony. He had been supportive throughout the entire ordeal, though he had worried constantly about the stress and expense. Seeing the finished park and the marker made it real for him in a way that my descriptions had not. "Your grandfather would be proud," he said quietly. "He bought this land because he valued independence and self-reliance. You honored that by fighting to protect it. That sentiment meant everything to me. The land represented generations of my family's work and investment, and I had successfully defended it against people who thought they could simply take what they wanted through bureaucratic manipulation and abuse of power." My business continued to grow, and the improved workshop allowed me to take on increasingly complex projects. I hired 2 assistants to help with the workload, both young people from the community who were interested in learning metalworking and fabrication. It felt good to be contributing to the local economy and providing opportunities for others. Tom Chen and I collaborated on several projects that combined his architectural vision with my fabrication skills. We developed a reputation for innovative custom work, and we started getting commissions from all over Arizona and neighboring states. The HOA, under its new leadership, continued to operate well. They enforced reasonable rules consistently and fairly, organized community events that brought people together, and maintained common areas without drama or conflict. It was everything an HOA should be, but so rarely is. I occasionally thought about Brenda, serving her sentence in state prison. Part of me felt sympathy for how completely her life had fallen apart, but mostly I felt that justice had been appropriately served. She had been given authority to serve her community, and she had abused that authority repeatedly and maliciously. The consequences were severe, but they were proportional to her actions. Gary Foster and Susan Winters had completed their probation and community service, and both had moved away from the area. I heard through the community grapevine that Gary had relocated to California and Susan to Colorado. Neither had any desire to remain in a place where everyone knew about their involvement in the HOA scandal. Philip Marchand, the attorney who had represented the HOA, faced professional consequences as well. The Arizona State Bar investigated his conduct, and while he wasn't disbarred, he received a public censure for failing to adequately advise his clients against illegal actions. His reputation was damaged, and he lost several major clients as a result. Meanwhile, Martin Reeves, my attorney, gained recognition as a property rights advocate. He started taking on more cases involving HOA overreach and abuse, often representing homeowners who couldn't afford his normal rates. The publicity from my case had given him a platform, and he used it to push for legislative reforms to HOA laws in Arizona. I testified before a state legislative committee about my experiences, and my testimony was part of the basis for a new law that created stronger oversight of HOA boards and clearer penalties for violations of property rights. The law passed with bipartisan support and was signed by the governor in June of 2026. By the summer of that year, life had fully normalized. The park was a hub of community activity, especially in the evenings when families would gather to let their kids play while adults socialized. I became a regular fixture there, often bringing Duke and staying to chat with whoever happened to be around. One evening, a new family introduced themselves. They had just moved into the community and wanted to meet their neighbors. As we talked, the husband mentioned that the positive community atmosphere and reformed HOA governance had been major factors in their decision to buy in Copper Ridge. We looked at several developments, but most of them had horror stories about tyrannical HOA boards, he explained. When we researched this community and found the articles about the reforms that happened after the corruption scandal, it actually made us more confident, not less. You all faced a serious problem and dealt with it properly." His wife added, "And this park is wonderful. We love that there's a community space where our kids can play and we can meet people." I didn't mention my role in any of it, but Frank Morrison happened to be walking by and overheard. He grinned and gestured at me. "You're talking to the guy responsible for the park. Isaac donated the land and helped build it." The new family thanked me enthusiastically, and we ended up having a long conversation about the community's history and values. It was satisfying to see that the reforms and positive changes were attracting good people who valued the same principles. As summer turned to fall, I realized that almost 2 full years had passed since Brenda's initial demand for my excavator. In that time, I had been through multiple court cases, a criminal investigation, the demolition of an illegal building, significant legal expenses, and the transformation of a hostile community environment into a positive one. It had been worth it. Every dollar spent on legal fees, every hour of stress and frustration, every moment of wondering if I was doing the right thing had been worth it. I had protected my property rights, held corrupt officials accountable, and helped create lasting positive change for an entire community. The excavator still sat beside my workshop, and I still used it regularly for various projects. Sometimes when I climbed into the cab and fired up the engine, I would think about that first confrontation with Brenda and smile at how much had changed since then. In October, the community held an election for HOA board positions. Frank Morrison ran for re-election as president, along with several other incumbents and a few new candidates. The election was orderly and well attended, and Frank won easily. The community had found good leadership and was smart enough to keep it. At the post-election gathering, Frank pulled me aside. "I want to thank you again for everything you did. I know it cost you a lot, both financially and in terms of stress. But you saved this community from itself." If Brenda had continued unchecked, she would have eventually destroyed everything good about living here. "I was just protecting my property," I said. "The broader impact was a side effect. Maybe, but it was a side effect that mattered. You showed people that it's possible to stand up to bullies and win if you're willing to fight for what's right." As the evening progressed, I found myself surrounded by neighbors who had become friends. We talked about everything from local news to our various projects to plans for upcoming community events. It was relaxed and genuine, the kind of social interaction that makes a place feel like home. Duke was popular with the kids, and I spent some time letting them pet him and throw a ball for him to fetch. Jennifer Cruz's youngest son, the same one who had thanked me for the park a year earlier, was especially enthusiastic. "Does Duke know any tricks?" he asked. I demonstrated a few commands, and Duke performed them perfectly. The kids were impressed, and several asked if I could teach them how to train dogs. I ended up agreeing to do an informal dog training workshop in the park the following weekend, which became surprisingly popular. That workshop turned into a regular monthly event. It gave me a chance to share knowledge I had accumulated over years of working with dogs, and it provided a valuable service to families in the community. It was yet another example of how the positive transformation of the community had created opportunities for connection and growth. As 2026 drew to a close, I took stock of where things stood. My property was secure, with clear legal precedents protecting it. My business was thriving and providing employment for others. I was an active, valued member of a healthy community. The legal and governance reforms that had resulted from the conflict with Brenda would benefit current and future residents for years to come. The story had started with an outrageous demand from an HOA president who thought she could commandeer my expensive equipment for free. It had escalated through multiple court cases and eventually criminal charges. It had involved an illegal building being constructed on my land and then demolished. It had cost tens of thousands of dollars in legal fees and consumed hundreds of hours of time and energy. But in the end, justice had prevailed completely. Brenda Patterson had been held fully accountable for her crimes and abuses of power. The community had reformed itself and emerged stronger and healthier. Property rights had been vindicated and protected through proper legal channels. Most importantly, the experience had taught me, and everyone else involved, some valuable lessons. We learned that individuals can successfully fight back against institutional abuse if they're determined and willing to use the legal system properly. We learned that communities are better served by cooperation and mutual respect than by coercion and fear. We learned that corruption and abuse of power, when exposed and challenged, cannot ultimately stand against transparency and the rule of law. The excavator that had been at the center of that initial confrontation still sits beside my workshop today. It's more than just a piece of construction equipment now. It's a reminder of the importance of standing up for your rights, of fighting back against those who would abuse their authority, and of the positive change that can result when people refuse to accept injustice. Every time I use it for a project, every time I see it through my workshop window, I remember that sometimes the most important thing you can do is simply say no to unreasonable demands and be willing to back up that refusal with whatever effort is required. The system worked because I made it work, because I refused to be intimidated or worn down, because I had the resources and determination to see the fight through to the end. And now, looking out over the community park on a quiet evening, watching families enjoy the space that was created from conflict and confrontation, I know that every moment of struggle was worth it. The illegal clubhouse they built on my land is gone, demolished and removed. In its place is something better, a symbol of community values, property rights, and the principle that no one, not even those in positions of authority, is above the law.